Often discussed, but of increased importance, innovation hot on the government's agenda, with changes now to bankruptcy laws in that regard, as well as being a major part of that reform package, the startup industry coming out to welcome the changes. However, there are concerns that banks could become stricter when it comes to their lending, as the reforms would actually make it easier for people to get out of their liabilities by going bankrupt. Well, let's get some context on this with Tim Klineberg, a restructure and insolvency partner at King & Wood Mallisons. Tim, welcome into the program. Sort of set the scene on this. That would sound, not to sort of draw too thin a bow on it, but just the idea in the US of a default on one's mortgage, handing back the keys. Are we talking about the same ease of getting out of one's obligations? Were these insolvency laws to be shunted through? Yes or no?
Look, I'd say no, Carson. I think it's an interesting set of reforms we've got before us here. The bankruptcy one's obviously interesting for individuals because cutting the time period of exit from 3 years to 1 year is a very significant reform, and clearly bankrupts fall into a lot of different categories, and some of them are more deserving of scrutiny than others. You know, it can be a question of bad luck and bad investments, or it can be a more sort of structured and difficult arrangement. There's a lot of high-profile individuals who've been through bankruptcy that, you know, some would argue should never have come out. So, I mean, it's a difficult question with bankruptcy. Are we
actually debating, though, the entire suite of changes that are necessary as identified by experts like yourself right here, right now, or have things been left off the table that you're concerned should have been honest in the quest to better enhance the legislative settings?
You can always, I mean, we could go on forever about the reforms that are necessary. The reality is here that there's been a long period of inaction on Australian insolvency laws for a long time, and that crosses the whole spectrum. What the government has done recently is move towards what's couched as an innovation agenda. So they're saying we're trying to foster activity and we're trying to reform restructuring and insolvency law to try and make people more willing to invest and take risks, and that makes sense in principle. The specifics here focus on some important areas. I think we would say yes. We're talking about not just the bankruptcy laws. The more important ones we would say are the safe harbour protections for directors. It's true that Australia is one of the most risky places to be a director, particularly for a distressed business. You're carrying around personal liability and risk of being prosecuted, and that risk doesn't go away.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's fair enough, but the penalty regime at the bottom of all of that, and we've seen this coming to light in the wake of judgments on MFS, have we not? And these are all on the record because they have been declared by the court. Penalties of $200,000 where there were millions of dollars in the frame there that led to collapses of misappropriated funds and other dealings that were found by the court in extensive inquiries to have been deliberately done. Now, on that measure, a fine of $200,000 is really an insult, is it not?
Yes, it is. If you look at that in isolation, it doesn't make any sense. The thing is, though, as a director, you carry personal liability for a whole bunch of other things that go beyond those penalties. So you're talking about criminal penalties and official sanctions from, you know, criminal things, but civilly, and the current reforms are structured around civil things. If you're personally liable for debts that the company incurs whilst it's insolvent, that's the current regime, and that worries a lot of directors and it affects their conduct. And so what we see is directors behaving very cautiously or possibly tipping companies into insolvency too early. And that's what one of the current forms is designed to deal with. Whether it does or not is another question. There's a big debate about that at the moment.
And how will that be tested? When you say whether it does or it doesn't, are we basically in uncharted sort of guinea pig territory, to put it bluntly, and we'll find out as we go along?
It's always a bit like that with reform, though, isn't it? Because it's really difficult to see. I mean, you can make predictions about behaviour, but these situations are complex and they move quickly, and you're dealing with individuals. I mean, we can talk about big corporates, small corporates. It's always an individual who's making the decision, and in this case, it's really easy for directors to put a company into an administration procedure. For example, all they've got to do is sign one piece of paper. The effects of that throughout the community can be cataclysmic, and what you find is thousands of people sometimes affected by that stroke of a pen. So those decisions need to be made carefully.
And you raise the interesting point, though, because you're effectively saying this regime will apply to, the whole industry rather than as a one-size-fits-all? Is that totally realistic, from the biggest to the big, right down the food chain? Is that wise to have a one-size-fits-all?
Well, that's the problem with reform, because we're dealing with blunt instruments here, and what they do is they affect everything. So we don't have a specific act for a specific type of business. They're all subject to the same rules. And so what you see is it's really hard. It's a one-size-fits-all approach by necessity. And you see the interest groups come into the legislative debate, don't they? So they'll push their own agendas. The reality is the government's got to strike the right balance between the different interest groups. And here what we see with insolvency reform is using the moniker of innovation is great, because everyone loves innovation and we all support that. The devil's in the detail here. How is this going to affect decisions every day by directors and companies?
Tim, how do these changes stack up against some of our international jurisdictions that we often trade with? We know that regularly the government will look to our international partners, particularly with mooted changes in media ownership laws, competition law. With these changes that they're proposing, how does that stack up relative to, say, the US or indeed the UK or Europe?
Yeah, it's a great question, because we're suffering a little bit here from guilt by association with the US, because US has got this amazing Chapter 11 regime that's used really effectively to restructure big companies and the business trades under the control of its directors. Australia doesn't have that procedure, and in fact the recent reforms confirm that we won't be moving in that direction. But what we're trying to do is tease in elements of it into our procedures, which are more creditor friendly and creditor based. So what you get here is a concept like ipso facto, which is a Latin term, and it basically means you can terminate a contract just because somebody's in insolvency procedure. In the United States, you can't do that in Chapter 11. There's a preclusion. You're not allowed to terminate, and what that is supposed to do is to keep the business trading, keep people dealing with the company and not terminating their contracts. And in Australia that doesn't happen, because everyone can just terminate, and in reality that is what happens. So when a company goes to insolvency, you have everybody terminating, or everybody trying to use that position to negotiate better pricing, and it just results in, it's not consistent with restructuring. So we're trying to tease those elements into our procedure. The danger that we have is that some of those reforms are trying to bring in debtor-based procedures like the US into the Australian creditor procedures, but we're not changing the whole procedure. So what the danger is, we end up with some very uncertain halfway house, and that's the risk, as you said before, Carson, with the reforms. It's a very much a one-size-fits-all approach, and that's a real danger here, and we are on the precipice of some very big changes.
So it sounds as if, though, to your original point, that we're trying to unlock via the moniker of innovation the idea that even directors aren't so risk averse, that they have that more of that spirit of risk taking that is a byword for a US corporate, admittedly generalizing, but if you do a compare and contrast on it with the aid of the Chapter 11 backdrop. Now, if you're saying we're still in a halfway house post all of these reforms, does the mindset of directors, in your estimation, if you look ahead, fundamentally change, or are they still liable to be hedging their bets, to be getting legal advice and to be wary as ever before?
Yeah, I mean, the way that it works in practice now is there's a whole bunch of boards in Australia that are taking risks every day, and they make very smart decisions on the whole, and people, there's innovation and there's great economic activity going on all the time, including with distressed companies. So one way you could look at it is you could say the system already works. They seek advice when they need to, and they try to do the best thing by the company, and they've got duties to make sure they do that. What we're seeing here is a risk of upsetting that delicate balance. And there are some reforms that are very smart here. For example, companies proposing schemes of arrangement. Currently that's a debtor-based procedure. That's a company procedure where it says we want to restructure our debts and we're going to court, and it's public and everybody knows about it. What you don't want is people terminating contracts on that business whilst it's going through that procedure. And part of these reforms would stop people terminating whilst companies are proposing schemes. And we think that's an excellent reform. But that said, it's only one small part of what is a very ambitious and wide-ranging reform that will have significant effects through the economy. So there's a risk there.
And meanwhile, the role of administrators and the spotlight on them, does any of this shake-up talk to their current activities, their current the sweep of rights that's upon them to do as they wish? I mean, we've even seen that this week with the likes of Arium and assets being determined to be put on the block, when arguably that could be seen as one step too far in the control process.
Well, I think large insolvent situations require really high-level expertise in terms of management. So what you've got is, in insolvency, you've got the board of directors standing to the side and you've got a new office holder coming in to take over the business. Now, the purpose of that is to firstly restructure if possible, and secondly it's to get the best outcome for creditors, which is better than a liquidation. So all of this is based around the fact that the business continues to trade for a period of time whilst options are explored. If that doesn't work out, then it has to be the best recovery for creditors. But the reality is, when a company goes into insolvency, there is a change of control and there's new administrators and new stakeholders that take control. And the people who take on these roles have a very important role to play in the economy. Do they go too far sometimes? Yes. Are there people in that community that have attracted criticism in the past and prosecutions? Yes. But the reality is that on the whole there's a lot of very well-run administrations in the market, and so it's just the way that the Australian regime deals with insolvency, which it has done for years, is not, you know, that's not subject to huge change. What we're talking about is tinkering.
Okay, so even the lessons on Chapter 11, where the directors continue to be, you know, day to day in on decision making, correct? The existing directors, you're saying there's no argument necessary to import that mindset and that approach?
Well, there's no suggestion in any of the discussions to date that Chapter 11 or another large debtor-based procedure in Australia is a current item for discussion. No one's ever raised that seriously as a concept. There was a Productivity Commission report last year which looked at it in principle and rejected it, and what they've moved towards now is the tweaking of the current system to try and regulate rights better. And like I said before, you know, there is a real opportunity here to make some very good changes and to improve the procedure, but it's not on the current agenda to make wholesale changes, and I certainly think that the administration procedure works very well, generally speaking. The outcomes are never happy for creditors because it's insolvency and people do miss out, but the reality is it an efficient way of reallocating the capital in insolvency? And I think most people in the market would say that it is, on the whole.
So Tim, I mean, we've touched on the fact that these mooted changes could be a positive for corporate governance because they become a little bit more creditor friendly. The real question, I guess, looking forward is where to from here. I mean, are you looking for some kind of a broader report, a la the report into productivity or the report into competition laws, so that there's more collaboration from participants in the market, or are you sort of saying, look, at this stage, just continue to tinker with the current regime?
Well, I think we've got an opportunity here to stop talking about some of these issues and actually do something. And I think some of the reforms that have been put out, some of the proposals in the current exposure paper are very good, and we think there's elements of those that can really improve outcomes. What we don't want to do is get bogged down in another wholesale reform exercise. We've sort of already had that in this area, and we need to sort of act. The point is, there are aspects of these reforms that are quite dangerous and need to be considered further. For example, the ipso facto prohibition I mentioned before, it goes too far, the current proposal. It needs to be pulled back to make sure that it doesn't overly change what are already pretty well settled relationships. In terms of a wholesale inquiry, I mean, we can have inquiry after inquiry and never achieve anything, particularly with this political cycle. It's really important that we take the easy wins now, I would say.
Yeah, because that's one step away from a royal commission.
Correct.
We do not want to go there, come hell or high water. Thank you so much, appreciate it. Tim Klineberg there, Klineberg, the restructurer and insolvency partner at King & Wood Mallesons, for you.